Hello, welcome to Genesis Mentors. This is Sagar Kamath and welcome to the third of our input sessions. In the first session, we talked about something which is very pertinent to India, something which made big news in 2019. That is the revocation of Article 370. In our previous session, input number 2, we spoke a little bit on the international front where we discussed at length the Chinese economic model. China has of course been involved in an ongoing trade war with the US, and that's another very pertinent topic as far as current affairs is concerned. Today we're going to focus on something which has been a part of global economic structures for quite some time, and even though the issue of Brexit and the Eurozone crisis might be close to a decade old now, with the Brexit deal being finalized by the end of the month and with Britain and Europe about to enter a new phase, this is something which is going to have far-reaching consequences on the future of international business. So in terms of trying to understand what Brexit is, or what exactly is the EU, let's take an in-depth look into the backstory of not only Europe as a continent, but also Europe as an economy. Now, arguably the most important economic power in the world today, of course, is the US. But if you go back just 70 years ago, that status was enjoyed by a lot of countries in Western Europe, namely the ex-colonial countries such as Britain, France, and Germany. So to understand how Britain has come along all of these years, we'll just do a quick recap through history. It will put us in a better perspective to understand what exactly was the European Union, what are its bedrock foundations. We'll familiarize ourselves with terms such as the ECB or the European Central Bank, the ERM or the exchange rate mechanism. And then of course we'll be in a better position to understand what a referendum would be. Okay, why exactly was roughly half the population of UK wanting to pull away or wanting to leave the European Union. So if you look at how far back Europe's economy has had a substantial say in terms of the rest of the world, we can once again start off with the all-important year 1945. This of course being the end of the Second World War. Now, Second World War, of course, was possibly humanity's, not just Europe's, but humanity's most destructive warfare ever. Okay, never before, or never after, or never since, fortunately, have so many weapons of mass destruction being unleashed at the same time. And Europe was in a state of absolute bankruptcy and turmoil at the end of 1945. So, for instance, entire countries like Germany had been stripped of their industrial potential to right up to ground zero. Post 1945, what was the most imminent need, the most pertinent need for Europe, was to ensure that a third destructive war should be something which is absolutely avoided. Europe already had two extremely destructive wars in a span of 40 years, and a third would have meant a point of no return. So a lot of solutions were proposed in terms of what Europe could do to avoid another major conflagration. One of the things which European economists suggested was that if the markets of Europe, the trade of Europe was somehow tied up, if they were somehow integrated, then it's very possible that when you have an integrated economy, when you have trade with, let's say, your immediate neighbors, you're less likely to go to war with them. And this to a certain extent is true, because if you look at any of the most important human conflicts, even of those of our times, let's say you go back another 150, 200 years, what we can call, let's say, the late medieval or the modern era. Even in that time, if you look at all the most important conflicts, it's primarily because the economies which were involved in those conflicts did not have, leading up to it, did not have substantial trade or economic relations. The markets weren't integrated. It becomes monumentally more challenging to actually go to war if your incomes are actually, or your economies are actually integrated. So Europe faced a similar circumstance, similar situation in 1945, where the economically pertinent thing to do was find a way to integrate the markets of Europe. Once you integrate them into a close, cohesive unit, then automatically neighboring countries such as Germany, France, Poland, Britain, of course, separated by the English Channel, they would be less likely to go to war. Now, how does one do that though? Because the problem is, while in theory there is nothing really to stop two countries from trading with each other, prior to the era of digitalization, and this is of course much prior to the advent of the internet, where a lot of the trade and the negotiations and the actual calculations and settlements had to be done physically, and they were not possible instantaneously. So for instance, if you go back, let's say 70 years to around 1945, or even in fact a couple of decades which followed, the big challenge with, let's say, getting France and Germany, two neighboring countries, two neighboring West European economies, with a particularly acrimonious past, right? France and Germany have been at war at least thrice, and I'm not even counting the two world wars. So if you need to get these two economies into increasing their trade relationships, how do you do that? Now you can always make sure that you lower your tariffs, right? That's the first step. So whatever tariffs you have which are blocking commodities from entering your country, right? This is protectionism. Tariffs of course are there so that you protect your domestic markets. But let's say the first step is you either reduce your tariffs or completely dissolve them. Now even if that's the case, even if that happens, let's say there's an individual business person in France who wants to import something from his neighbor German. Okay, so now he's going to of course import the commodity from Germany, and in exchange he'll have to make payments to Germany. Now the payments of course which he'll make as a French citizen are likely to be in the franc, right, the old currency of France. So he sends essentially a total amount in terms of francs, which could of course get converted through the transaction through any of the major banks, French or German. It could get converted into the Deutschmarks, the German currency. Now of course, how do you decide how much francs corresponds to how many Deutschmarks? And for that it will have to depend on the relative exchange rates, right? That on the day when you actually transact, what exactly is the exchange rate between Germany and France? Now of course this is a hurdle which can be overcome, but it actually is not so straightforward. So here's the thing. Let's say a French business person who's looking at the markets very carefully and looking at the exchange rates very carefully decides on a Monday that okay, this is a good time, since 1 franc on that particular day equals to 1 Deutschmark. So it decides on a Monday to, let's say, place the order. Okay, now when you place the order and you're placing it in Germany, and this is pre the internet, right? So the order has to be sent across in some kind of physical channel. It's possible by the time the German seller confirms the order, it's already midweek. By the time the order is actually shipped across, and after which the payment is going to be issued, it could be even up to be a month. By which point the exchange rate, it's very likely, could have moved. That could either move in favor of France or it could move in favor of Germany, right? So which would mean that by the time the seller actually has to make the payment, he'll either have to submit fewer francs or in fact even more francs. So if the French economy in the interim period has done better relatively than the German economy, the franc of course increases in value. And even though this might be relative, but we're talking about large scale orders, then even if it's going to be falling by a few points here and there or rising by a few points here and there, that could depend on, let's say, a business deal being profitable or a business deal being bankrupt. So as a result, since the exchange rate fluctuations could not be calculated or could not always be predicted, right? You couldn't really and always predict what's going to happen maybe a month from now. Countries were less keen on trading internationally as they were trading domestically. And this had always been the deterrent which had prevented European countries, neighboring countries also, from trading. Of course, the time elapsed from the point when you want to place an order to the point when you actually make your payments could be even greater if you're talking about non-neighboring countries. So let's say France has to trade with someone, with a country or with another business interest, maybe in Italy or maybe Switzerland. So this has always proven to be a problem, which essentially means that trade between countries is restricted by the exchange rates. Now of course, even before the Second World War, whatever little trade would take place between neighboring countries, there were other ways you can actually handle it. For instance, you have something called as financial derivatives. Now what is a financial derivative? It's also called as a hedge. Now what is a derivative or a hedge? If let's say someone in France wants to interact with someone in Germany, but then they're concerned about the same things that we discussed right now, that you might be very tempted to place an order because the exchange rate is in your favor. By the time you place the order, by the time the other person sends the item across and you make the payment, the exchange rate might turn against you. This fear will also reside in the person on the other side, right? Because even he or she will have the same concerns in mind. Now, as a result, the two parties can agree into a contract which is called as a financial derivative. Now, according to this, what happens is, even before they start the process of buying and selling, they decide to enter into a contract where they fix the value of that exchange between the two of them, and they'll fix it to a specific value, which could be an intermediate value, which would mean it would be slightly against the French and slightly against the Germans on the day that they are going to be planning the exchange. So what would happen is, if you fix a particular rate, let's say 1 franc equals to 1 Deutschmark, now on that particular day when the payment actually is going to happen, you're going to ignore the actual exchange rate and go ahead with your financial derivative. So sometimes you make a profit, sometimes you make a loss. In case markets are more in favor more in your favor on that day, you might tend to regret making the transaction, right? Because you've already fixed it up. On the other hand, if the markets are against you, you actually bless the day that you sign the derivative. So derivatives are one way where trade could happen, okay, even after World War II, but clearly it was not a successful large-scale instrument. So European economists began speculating, is there another way where the idea of the derivative, of fixing up the rate of exchange, could it be somehow extrapolated on a continental scale, right? Rather than derivatives being signed individually between business interests across boundaries, is it not possible to somehow extrapolate this and make it applicable on a continental scale? So then all of Europe agrees with a particular exchange rate, at least for a set period. And these speculations meant that in 1971, okay, close to 30 years after the Second World War, European countries except for Britain, okay, West European countries except for the UK, entered into an agreement called the ERM, or the exchange rate mechanism. Now, what was the ERM? What was it going to be doing? It was essentially like a macro level financial derivative. So once a party or once a country would enter into the ERM, so let's say Germany enters into the ERM, and France is already a member, let's say, and so is Portugal, and so is Spain. Now what would happen is, the central banks in each of these economies would be closely integrated. So the German central bank, which is the chief custodian for issuing and regulating the flow of Deutschmarks in Germany, it would have to maintain an intricate partnership with the French central bank, and so on and so forth. So you're integrating the central banks in all the economies which are part of the ERM. Now what happens is, at the start of the month, the central banks all collaborate, look at how trade has happened or how markets have actually fluctuated in the previous month, and then decide unilaterally across the board to agree on one specific exchange rate mechanism or one specific exchange rate, which would mean that it would be decided for a month from now that 1 franc equals to 1 Deutschmark, which might actually go on to equal 2 Italian lira, okay, and so on and so forth, depending on the relative strength of each market. So which would mean that once the exchange rate is announced across the continent and you actually know how the exchange rate works across the continent, all European economies and all their business interests within them would have a month during which they could actually import and export completely free of the burden of regulating or hedging. Because for a month, come what may, regardless of how the markets do, the exchange rate is going to remain the same. So this is a contract, this is an insurance policy to ensure that you actually do profit and you actually do make your money. You can make a smart bet, you can check out what the rate is, and you can order supplies, you can sell supplies at a fixed rate of exchange, regardless of what happens in the market. So in a sense, the idea behind the ERM was various countries, okay, close to 20 countries, were going to be linking their monetary policies, which would mean that the central bank's monetary policy, what is a monetary policy again? it's a policy which roughly, I mean, if you had to define it on a rough scale, monetary policy is the amount of money flow or the cash flow that the central bank in an economy regulates. So how much money is pumped into the economy every year, every month or every year or every day is decided by the monetary policy. So the ERM would link the monetary policies of all central banks. They would have to now maintain a specific cash flow because they can't really afford to have inflations and deflations, right? Since your exchange rate is going to be fixed, you can't afford to have your currency inflate or deflate. It has to stay the same. The only country which chose not to join the ERM in the 1970s when it was proposed was the UK. Now, the United Kingdom has always been suspicious about these kind of transnational or transcontinental partnerships, and it had its own interests in the 70s for not joining the ERM. But come the 1980s, Britain actually began feeling the pressure, because while the rest of Europe began to have a stabilizing influence courtesy the ERM, trade was actually profiting and Europe wasn't actually looking towards another war, right? From 1945 till date, we actually haven't had tensions in Europe, and today the thought that Germany and France could engage in an all-out conflict seems unthinkable. So the ERM did have a sobering influence. Trade and the lowering of tariffs and actually, ensured through the ERM that European economies were more integrated. And there was increasing pressure on Britain to be a part of the system. By the late 80s, the pressure was mounting to a fever pitch. But Britain had a very, very ardent Prime Minister, someone who was always going to be standing by her words, by the name Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher kept insisting that the ERM is a bad idea, and she had very valid reasons for that. Her concerns were that yes, while the monetary policies of all of these individual kingdoms or individual countries are integrated, so that you are regulating how much cash each central bank pumps into the system, what you're not regulating is the fiscal policies. Now, what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is the amount of spending that a government has to do. And that depends to a large extent on the needs of a country, right? The environmental needs of a country would differ. Their spending capacities as a result would differ. The kind of mindset that the people live in would differ. Their work ethics would differ. So the spending which a nation engages in is going to be different. And Thatcher's concern was that if you keep linking the monetary policies but not link the fiscal policies, countries are going to spend according to their own whims and fancies, and yet they're going to somehow supposed to manage all of that using the same limited budget. So this is unduly pressurizing the economy to make cutbacks and make changes. So Thatcher insisted that this is not going to happen. By 1990 though, Britain's state without being part of the ERM was deplorable. They had been under a constant downside. Their economy had been going down for a good 10 years. And by 1990, in Margaret Thatcher's own government, there was the major opposition that she faced from a man by the name John Marshall. There was a major opposition that she faced from a man named John Major. Now, who was John Major? John Major was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is essentially equivalent to a finance minister. It's a finance-based portfolio in the government. So John Major was a fervent supporter of the ERM. He believed that without joining the ERM, Britain's economic futures could not take a turn for the better. In fact, Major was so influential and so convinced with the ERM that by 1992, even without Thatcher's consent, John Major convinced UK to join the ERM. And as a result, Thatcher stepped back. She said that if this is how it's going to be, there's absolutely no point going ahead with it. So she resigned and John Major becomes the UK Prime Minister. So UK is a part of the ERM the start of the 90s. Now, however, even after joining the ERM, and even though this is a great political victory for John Major, Britain's fortunes did not actually show too much signs of improving. Britain continued to slip. And this is probably a problem or a rot that Margaret Thatcher, the ex-Prime Minister, had also foreseen. She realized that it's not just about stimulating trade, but a lot of UK-based assets are defunct, and which is possibly why re-stimulating them is necessary, not necessarily just joining a common a common trade union. John Major, however, was insistent that the longer UK stays a part of the ERM, the better it will be for the economy. In October of 1992, there was an event which took place which caused the Bank of Britain, Britain's central bank, which had now been integrated with the other banks in the ERM, to almost completely unravel. Now what happened was, since the pound had kept falling, and it kept falling dramatically, speculators, people who were buying and selling the UK currency, the pound sterling, leading up to October of 1992, had managed to collect billions and billions of pounds at very cheap prices since the pound had fallen. Now what happened is, on the 16th of October 1992, they decided to sell huge sums of money in the open market, huge sums of UK money in the open market, thus ensuring that the currency or the value of the pound would keep depreciating. Of course, if you suddenly introduce a huge number of currency, which formerly had been maybe part of the reserve currencies of other nations. So what a lot of these speculators would do is that they would buy the pound from other countries, maybe from Germany, from France. These countries were willing to sell them pounds in exchange of maybe a stronger currency, let's say the dollar or maybe the Deutschmark. That's because nobody expected the pound to actually do very well. So they managed to buy a lot of pounds cheap, and then they managed to dump it into the UK markets on a specific day. Now, as a result, the Bank of Britain, when they realized the amount of money which was being supplied or dumped into the UK markets, it realized that to prevent a recession and to prevent an immediate deflation of the currency, they had to buy back pounds. So the Bank of Britain goes into overdrive and starts buying back pounds. So around 8:30 in the morning, they buy back £1 billion, and it's clear that that's not enough. They also try through the day to increase the rates of exchange. They also try to increase the rate of interest. So for instance, if you've been given a loan and you were earlier going to be paying the bank back at a loan of at an interest rate of, let's say, 10%. By afternoon, the interest rates have been hiked to 12%, which is unthinkable otherwise, 2 entire percent in a single day. And by the evening, they try increasing that to 15%, and still it's not going to, still nothing is working out, because speculators keep selling pounds through the whole day. By the end of the day, UK makes a fateful decision that even though John Major was of course dead set against it, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Finance Ministry decide to suspend the pound from the ERM. So which would mean that 1992 is the first incident of the UK joining a transnational corporation or a transnational agreement which was similar to the euro. It's just that the currencies were different, but the rate of exchange was going to be fixed. But it's the first instance of the UK actually joining and then exiting a trans-European idea. So Europe has already had evidence or a history of Britain's fickleness. This is not an economy which in the last 30 years has endeared itself to the rest of Europe. This is 1992. When Britain almost crashed, it crashed out of the ERM and its banks almost came up completely unraveled. But by the end of the decade, that is 1999, learning from the mistakes of the ERM and vowing never to repeat them, Europe embarked on an even more ambitious policy. This time, rather than link different currencies under a fixed rate of exchange, 17 countries across Europe decided to suspend their own currencies and start a new value called as the euro. So this is the birth of Europe as not simply a coalition of many different warring princely states or kingdoms. At the start of the 2000s, Europe enters into a new phase where we're talking about all the economies in West Europe, at least, being linked under a common currency known as the euro, which would mean Britain would actually give up the pound sterling, Germany would give up the Deutschmark, France would give up the franc, Italy would give up the lira, Sweden could give up the krona, and they would all be considered part of one system, which would now, from now on, be using the euro. Britain, as before, had a few reservations on this front and decided to actually keep both the pound and the euro going for some amount of time. So just to ensure that, Britain was very wary of putting both legs in the basket this time around. Nonetheless, the euro, or the Eurozone as it was called, begins to pick up, and the first 10 years of the 2000s, Europe once again sees a period of unprecedented trade brilliance. The economies are able to do better than before. Even weaker economies like Albania and Greece are able to be pulled along because the rest of Europe, which is dominated by Germany, an extremely robust economy, is now integrated into the euro. So how do you integrate so many different countries into one currency? So the central banks of all of these individual countries would now answer directly to a common authority called as the ECB, or the European Central Bank. So the European Central Bank would be the central mechanism or the central agency which is responsible for both the monetary policies of individual countries and its own monetary policy. It would decide how much money or how much euro to actually mint every year, how much euro would each country get. So how do you decide which country gets what? Because now if there's going to be a common currency, then a weak economy like Greece could suddenly have aspirations of becoming as powerful as Germany, right? If everyone is going to get the euro. But of course, that's not how it works. For countries to be able to suspend their own currencies, they had to hand over all of that currency to the European Central Bank. The price of the euro was fixed against the dollar, and countries would have to buy the euro using their own currencies. So of course, you can buy only that much euro based on how much currency you have. So for instance, an economy like Greece, which had a currency called as a drachma, which is not very powerful, even in 1999-2000, was able to purchase a few euro, as compared to Germany, whose Deutschmark was extremely robust, and as a result able to purchase a larger amount of euro. So countries continue to be relative to each other in terms of their economies. Greece doesn't suddenly become at par with other major powers. But of course, now that Greece is a part of the same financial transactions, it's using the same currency, it can theoretically get some advantages. So when the euro experiment kicked off, there was of course a lot of hope, a lot of anticipation that this is going to herald a new era. But again, like before, like with the ERM, there were economists who were concerned about it. And they're once again pointing out the fact that even under the ECB, while countries were able to link their monetary policies, and now they also had one currency, the ECB also yet wasn't really controlling or regulating their fiscal policies, which would mean countries could still spend and operate in a manner that they deemed fit. Now, of course, it was unthinkable for a private bank like the ECB, which is not exactly a bank of any one country, right? It was unthinkable for them to decide fiscal policies for individual countries, because then countries would claim that, this is a breach of our sovereignty. If a private company decides to tell you or begins to tell you how you should be spending your money, that would be taken as breach of sovereignty by most countries, thus making the European experiment very unpopular. So the ECB's functions weren't fiscal, they were strictly monetary. From the year 2000 to the year 2010, the first decade did see huge profits made across Europe. However, by the end of the decade, from 2008 to 2010, situations seem to have turned 180 degrees. Now, this mainly happened because some of the warnings of the economists, which were quite similar to Mrs. Thatcher's warnings in the 80s, about fiscal policies being a problem or different fiscal policies being a problem, those did come back to rankle Europe. Let's take the example of Greece and Spain. Now, two economies which had, prior to the European Union, not been considered very favorable economies. The Greeks, for instance, had a culture which is based out of tourism. Now, tourism is not really something that you have to work very hard at, right? Especially if your tourism comes out of natural resources or your tourism comes out of historic sites, like what the Greeks have. So this kind of tourism does not require a lot of labor. It does not require a lot of initiative. And over the decades, the Greek citizens had become increasingly complacent about how their next meal or how the money would actually flow. You'll always have tourists during especially the good months. You'll always have a regular flow of income. The country can essentially function even without collecting more than 12% of all the taxes that citizens owe to them. So citizens actually withhold the taxes and as a result end up becoming richer or end up having more money. The country doesn't really care much about it because what it loses out in tax revenue, it actually makes up in tourism. Now contrast this with Germany, which is a highly industrious country where working for an average of 40 to 50 hours a week is considered par for the course. And you have an extremely intelligent, hard-working set of people who are looking at taking the country and the economy only in one way. The only thing that these two economies share, Greece and Germany, post 1999, is a common currency. Now the fears of the economists were actually starting to become true when the fact that Greece was able to use the euro meant that yes, it would not necessarily stimulate the markets directly in Greece, but banks which were initially reluctant to give the Greeks loans. So nobody wanted to give Greece any loans, right? They had a bad repayment record and nobody even felt that they could repay anything. Now that they were actually part of a common setup, international banks, transnational banks, a lot of them European banks, private banks began to get increasingly emboldened that you can grant countries like Greece and Spain, you can grant them money, you can grant them loans. You don't really have to worry terribly much about repayment, because even if the Greeks default, because their economies are interlinked, it will ultimately one way or the other be Germany's headache to repay. Why Germany? Essentially the European Central Bank, but its biggest player or biggest customer of course being Germany. So if everybody is borrowing money from the same bank, and if then this system borrows money from another private bank, the private bank doesn't really have to worry about recovering money from this particular player, the subprime player like Greece. It has a guarantor which is a transnational bank, the European Central Bank, and it has economies like Germany who are acting as guarantors for Greece without actually realizing that they're doing so. So you have a system where banks begin to lend money to the Greeks in increasing proportions starting from 2000. Now Greek political parties began to sense this change and begin to borrow extensively. Now what is it that they do is, political parties of course have vested interests. Yes, superficially they would claim things like development and hence the borrowing. But politicians in Greece and political parties began to stumble on an idea that what is it that the person would want even more than being granted employment. The only thing you can think of as being more lucrative as compared to promising jobs is promising welfare. That even if you don't have a job, the state will look after you. And where's the money going to come from the state? The money comes from borrowing. So in exchange for creating a vote bank, a dedicated vote bank, political parties begin borrowing money, using it as a trade-off, wherein they're using that money to pay off people's welfare. Unemployment benefits reach ridiculous proportions, where people are actually making more money once they quit their job than when they were actually working. And you can actually quit your job for ridiculous reasons, things like fatigue or boredom. This is the status which the Greeks embark on through the first half of the 2000s. Now what happens is, as a result, Greece is incurring debt after debt, and banks are perfectly happy to keep lending because they know that the guarantors is the rest of the European economies. The rest of Europe of course isn't paying close attention to this because, like I said, even the ECB wasn't regulating a country's spending. There was no control on fiscal policies. Spain begins replicating a similar model where it takes huge amounts of money from banks to construct housings. So you have a real estate boom across Spain, but what most people don't realize is that the money which is being used for creating this artificial boom is borrowed money. So it's not really money that Spain is generating, it's just borrowed from international banks. And a lot of the housings are very, very cheap and they actually have no demand. 2007, as we neared the end of the decade, and 2008, the stock markets in the US begin to crash and the Great American Depression or the Great American Recession begins. Now, of course, while it doesn't directly affect Europe, at least not in terms of the economies, but the banks which are operating in Europe, the banks which have given out loans to places like Greece, are the same banks which are facing massive cutbacks in the US. For instance, JP Morgan, or Goldman Sachs, or Credit Suisse, Barclays, Royal Bank of Scotland, Deutsche Bank. Now these are some big players who had major losses in the US, and now they go into overdrive trying to recover money from European investments. So for instance, the process of recovery from Europe begins. 2008 to 2010, banks are now desperate to take back the money that they have given as loans to countries like Greece, who of course simply raise their hands because that money doesn't exist anymore. It's been funneled down. It's not been put to any kind of productive uses where it can multiply and you can actually pay it back. It's simply been handed out as handouts or welfare. Once the banks realize that Greece is not going to be able to pay, the question of who's going to pay then shifts to the European Central Bank. Now, of course, the ECB on one hand could simply look at these banks and say, you've just made a bad investment, live with it, right? Or let your insurance companies pick up the slack. But that's not how it works. The problem is, the bigger the bank becomes, the more impossible it finds to fail. Because if a massive bank fails, then the money that is tied up, which is individual money and not necessarily of the perpetrator, any person who has an account at the bank, their money also collapses. So because Greece is unable to pay, and let's say if the ECB doesn't come up with a method of repayment, you'll have economies across the world and across Europe specifically collapse because their money is also tied up in the banks. So you simply can't afford to let the banks go bust. So now how do you bail the banks out? How do you make back the payments? Because Greece is unable to do that. Germany, of course, is furious, and the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, who's still in power today, she immediately proposes austerity measures. So what are austerity measures? Austerity measures are where each country across Europe, not just Greece, each country has to practice poverty, wherein you have to cut back on all things which would be otherwise considered par for the course. So there's less food available, there's less salaries which are being doled out. Everything, anyone and everyone has to practice austerity. Okay, you have to work within very minimal levels. So Europe goes through a great irony that in the start of the second decade, from 2010 onwards, countries like Ireland, countries like Britain, countries like Italy and Germany are practicing austerity so that Greece and the money that Greece and Spain and Italy have borrowed can actually be paid back. So this is of course an extremely toxic process, and it was partly aided by the fact that around 2014, Europe also witnessed a massive increase in the surge of illegal migrants or refugees who were desperately trying to escape the horrors of the Middle East. So the Arab Springs had happened, the Syrian civil war was at absolute peak, and with ISIS running riot, you had millions and millions of civilians trying to escape into any country that would have them. So from 2014 onwards, under Chancellor Angela Merkel's guidance, Europe threw open its gates. Now, not everyone in Europe was actually happy with this surge of insurgents because there were real fears. Are there terrorist fighters alongside these refugees? How do you vet one from the other? Why are there so many young, able-bodied men coming through? Where are the women and children? Is Europe going to be swamped by Islamic immigrants? Is there going to be a change of demography, right? Will Europe ever be the same again? Merkel, of course, had no time for such concerns because her immediate reasons were that if the Greeks aren't willing to pay back, and Greece is a spent force, then those who now are resettled in Greece, the migrants, will find a way of compensation, will find a way of paying. So now you have a system where you'll have your refugees coming in, working at less than minimum wages, being integrated into the economic structures, and thus bailing Europe out of this crisis. Now, as diabolical as this method seems, it seems to have succeeded because come 2019, Europe seems to have overcome its problems of the previous 2 decades. So the problems with regards to bank financing are gone, the loans that were given out have been paid back, and Europe once again is profitable. So why does Britain want to pull out now? The Brexit issue first became apparent in 2015. The referendum was conducted in 2015 when the question was asked as to whether Britain wanted actually to be a part of a system like this or wanted out. And roughly 51% of the UK voting population said that we actually want out. And that's because Europe, like the rest of Europe, even Britain was concerned that if you have wholesale immigration policies entrusted upon us, and if there is going to be austerity whenever Germany says there's going to be one. So we rather not be part of a system like this. We'll rather not have our economies integrated with the ECB. Now, of course, pulling out of an organization such as this is even tougher than it was pulling out of the ERM, which the UK could suspend overnight. The problem with the euro is, or the Eurozone is, it's not just fixing your currency at a fixed rate against the others. You're using the same currency. So all the money in the UK is inextricably linked to the money in the European Central Bank and the rest of the European economies, which would mean that businesses which have been trading with the continent because they were once part of the same system now would demand that if they have to pull out, you make good all their payments. That's also going to happen the other way around. European interests which are linked in Britain are now going to demand that if you're going to suddenly cut yourself off, make good all our damages. Whatever money we're going to lose, you'll have to pay all of that up. And that's why the deal or the Brexit deal is becoming an extremely tricky affair. We had David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, under whom the referendum was signed. He had stepped back. Theresa May tried her best for a couple of years. And now you have Boris Johnson, who seems poised to actually sign the Brexit deal. So by the end of this month, January end, we would know for certain what the Brexit deal is going to look like and what the future of European economies are going to look like. But having moved out of transnational agreements twice within a span of 30 years, it's unlikely that the UK's economies in the future are going to be allowed to be linked in any capacity at all with the rest of European economies. So we have some very interesting times ahead in our future. The first quarter of the 21st century has already proved to be very exciting, especially when it comes to Europe. The old world, or the old world order as it was once called, seems poised to be changing forever. So for any questions that you might have, you can ping them into the comments column below. And like and make sure you remember to subscribe to our channel, and make sure you also remember to like this video. For more such updates and more such input sessions, stay tuned. Thank you.